All right, let's dive into a story about a piece of technology that completely changed the way business works. We're talking about Enterprise Resource Planning Systems, or ERP. It's a story about tearing down invisible walls and building something completely new from the ground up.
So here's our game plan. We'll start in the chaotic world before ERP, then look at the perfect storm that made a revolution possible. We'll see how a company named SAP totally changed the game, talk about the mind-boggling costs involved, and finally get to what I think is the most important piece of the puzzle. Let's get into it.
Okay, so to really get this, we have to go back in time. Our story starts in a world of total data chaos, where vital information was basically locked up inside different departments. And the best way to picture this is with the idea of silos. Seriously, imagine every department, sales, manufacturing, HR, finance, as its own giant sealed container. Each one has its own pile of data, its own information, but there's no way for it to talk to the others. Information just couldn't move where it needed to go. And this wasn't just some abstract problem. It had huge real-world consequences. Think about a company. Let's call it Mountaineering Inc. The manager on the production line needs to know what people are actually buying. How many tents do we need this month? Are hiking boots selling well? But all that juicy sales data is locked away in the sales department silo. So without any real information, that manager's left to, what? Guess? And as you know, guessing in business is a recipe for disaster. You either make too much stuff that nobody wants, or you don't make enough of the hot-ticket items and you lose out on sales. So obviously, this way of doing things was completely broken. It just couldn't last. And by the late 80s and early 90s, a bunch of different factors started coming together to create this perfect storm for a massive change. It really all came down to three key things happening at once. First, the technology was finally catching up. Computers were getting powerful enough to even attempt something this big. Second, business leaders started thinking in a totally new way. And third, you had these massive external pressures, including a kind of digital time bomb, that basically forced companies to make a move.
Let's start with the tech. At the heart of it all was Moore's Law. This simple observation meant that computing power was growing exponentially, while the cost was dropping just as fast. All of a sudden, the idea of one giant, interconnected software system running an entire company in real time went from being a sci-fi dream to something that was actually possible.
And of course, this didn't happen overnight. The groundwork was being laid for decades. You had mainframes in the 60s getting the ball rolling. Then, relational databases in the 70s gave us a smart way to organize all that data. And finally, client-server networks in the 80s gave us a way to share it. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together.
But the final nudge, the thing that really pushed so many companies over the edge, was the Y2K bug. See, for decades, programmers saved computer memory by only using 2 digits for the year, like 99 for 1999. No one thought these programs would still be around in the year 2000. So companies were faced with this terrifying choice. Either spend a fortune fixing every single line of their old, creaky, siloed code, or take a leap of faith, scrap the old systems entirely and invest in a brand new, integrated ERP that would solve the Y2K problem and modernize their whole operation at the same time.
So, the stage is set. Everyone knows there's a huge problem, and the technology is right on the cusp of being ready. And right on cue, a German software company called SAP enters the story. They'd been working on a revolutionary idea that was about to have its moment in the sun.
And what SAP was selling wasn't just software. It was a fundamental shift in thinking. The old way, the functional model, was vertical. Information had to go up the chain of command and then back down. It was slow, it was clunky. But the new process model that ERP made possible, it was horizontal. Information could flow directly from sales to the warehouse to accounting, instantly. It allowed for quick, smart, flexible decisions.
This was the big idea from SAP, which was started way back in '72 by 5 guys who used to work at IBM. They had some early success with mainframe software, but the real breakthrough came in 1992 when they released SAP R3. This was the system that truly shattered the silos and brought the power of real-time integrated data to the masses.
So, what was the secret sauce here? Why was R3 such a big deal? Well, for starters, it was built around a single common database. That's the key. No more separate piles of data. Everyone in the company was looking at the exact same information, and it was updated in real time. On top of that, it was built on that modern client-server architecture. You could buy it in modules, and it was open, so other companies could build cool stuff for it too. It was the whole package.
So this technology was incredible, a true game changer. But, and you knew there was a but coming, this kind of progress came with a truly eye-watering price tag. This was not a project for the faint of heart.
I mean, just look at these numbers. For a big company, we're talking about a total cost of anywhere from $100 million to $500 million. And that wasn't just the software. That included all the new hardware, the expensive consultants, and years of work to completely rewire the company.
Which brings us to the $500 million question, right? After spending all that time and all that money, was it actually worth it? Did companies really get their money back?
Well, the data tells a pretty interesting story. One big study found that, yeah, for the majority, 63%, they saw a positive return on their investment. But look at that other slice. For more than a third of companies, it either wasn't a positive return or they couldn't even figure it out. It was a massive gamble.
And if you want to see what happens when that gamble goes wrong, oh boy, look no further than Hershey Foods in 1999. They tried to flip the switch on their new ERP system right before Halloween, their busiest time of year. It was a disaster. They couldn't process orders, they couldn't ship chocolate, they literally couldn't get candy to the stores, and they lost a huge piece of the Halloween market. That's how high the stakes were.
And that Hershey story, it leads us directly to the final and, frankly, the most important lesson in this entire saga. It turns out the biggest risks and the biggest rewards of ERP had very little to do with the computers. It was all about the people.
Here it is. If you take away only one thing, let it be this. When these massive, expensive projects went off the rails, it almost never was because the software itself was broken. It was because of people problems, bad planning, not managing expectations, and forgetting that you weren't just installing software, you were fundamentally changing how everyone did their jobs.
So what kind of people problems are we talking about? Well, it was all the stuff that seems so obvious in hindsight. Companies would rush the planning phase, or they'd cheap out on training for their employees. Sometimes you had no single person in charge to drive the project. But the biggest mistake of all was just not understanding how disruptive and difficult this change would be for the actual people who had to use this new system every single day.
And you want some hard data on that? The research firm Gartner actually put a number on it. They recommended that a full 17% of an ERP project's budget should be spent on training alone. And they found that companies that spent less than 13% were 3 times more likely to have their project run into serious trouble. Investing in your people wasn't just a nice-to-have, it was absolutely critical for success.
So, at the end of the day, ERP systems were a triumph. They smashed the silos, connected the modern company, and created efficiencies we just take for granted now. But the story leaves us with this huge, lingering question, one that's maybe more important today than ever. Our technology is always getting faster and more powerful, but has our ability to manage the human side of all that change actually kept pace? That's definitely something to think about.